Hello, I'm Steve Lusk with the Red Bank Church of Christ, and here's our Sunday school lesson for April the 12th, 2020. For the last several weeks in our adult Bible classes at Red Bank Church of Christ, we have been looking at the Gospel of Luke, and today we're going to look at a section from Luke, chapters 22 and 23. So if you have a Bible, then maybe join us, and we're going to be discussing this together. So at this time, I would like to bring in one of our other adult teachers, Trevor Hass. Trevor, hey, there you are. Good. Trevor's joining us here with our adult Bible class discussion on the Gospel of Luke, and we're glad to have you. How are things at your house?
Oh, it's going good. It's going good.
Good.
Everybody's doing good.
Yeah.
Hopefully it won't make too much noise here. I'm picking the quietest part of the house. So.
I bet that's a pretty hard thing to find in your house, a quiet place. Yeah, that's right. So if you don't know, Trevor's got a bunch of kids. So that's what he's. So if we have a kid interrupt us, that's okay. You know, Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me." So that won't be that bad. So. All right. So our discussion of Luke has not been a traditional verse by verse study, but we're looking at Luke from the standpoint of discipleship, right, Trevor?
That's right.
We don't want to look at every single verse, but we want to look at sections in the Gospel of Luke that tell us two things. Number one, what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus? How can I be a better disciple? How can I be a follower of Jesus that would be pleasing to him? And then number two, how can I be a better disciple maker? In other words, as a disciple of Jesus, I want to grow to the point that I can not only be a disciple, but I can make disciples, make followers of Jesus. And I do that, of course, by growing as a disciple. So that's what our whole idea is about. So we're looking at this with discipleship in view. And our lesson today in our 11th week of this study is from, as I've already indicated, from Luke 22 and the first part of 23. And we've entitled this lesson, The Qualm Before the Storm. And that's a little bit of a play on the idea of the calm before the storm, because a qualm is a feeling of uneasiness about a point of conscience or propriety. It's a sudden feeling of disturbing emotion, such as doubt or fear. And what we're going to see here is we're going to see two individuals, Peter and Pilate, who had some qualms about what was happening to Jesus. Now, remember, we're coming to the last days of Jesus' life. The so-called triumphal entry into Jerusalem has occurred. He's been in and around the temple for a few days. In chapter 22, he has what we call the Last Supper, and he institutes the Lord's Supper. John tells us that he washes his disciples' feet and talks to them about service. There's a accusation that someone among that group is going to betray him. And it's interesting in the setup for our passage we're going to look at about Peter, that Peter's one of the ones who says, "Lord, I'll even die with you," in Luke 22, verse 33. And Jesus just says, "Peter, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. And Peter's just dumbfounded by that. But of course, we're going to see what happens. So, Trevor, if you will, read for us Luke 22, verses 54 through 62. This is after the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane when the crowd comes and takes Jesus away.
Then they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. And Peter was following at a distance. When they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down among them. Then a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the light and looking closely at him, said, "This man also is with him." But he denied, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." And a little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are speaking of." And after an interval of about an hour, still another insisted, saying, "Certainly this man also was with him, for he too is Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the saying of the Lord. Now he said to him, "Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly.
Wow. What a passage. What we would like to do here is we'd like to throw out some questions with maybe a few comments, but mainly to get you to thinking about this particular passage in light of your discipleship, your following of Jesus, okay? And so what we're going to do is throw out these questions with maybe a couple of comments here and there, but then we would like for you to pause the video here momentarily and discuss these questions if you're in a small group, or just give some consideration to these questions as you examine this text. So the first question that I have is, why do you think Peter followed Jesus to the high priest's house in the first place? I mean, in the garden, we were told that Peter had defended Jesus by pulling out a sword and even tried to apparently attack someone and cut off the high priest servant's ear. And all this takes place, and now they lead him away, and everybody leaves except Peter begins to follow Jesus. And so that's an interesting question. Why do you think Peter followed Jesus to this high priest's house where this Jewish phase of the trial was beginning in the very first place? Seems like he'd already sort of established himself as I'm heading the other direction now. So that's a good question to consider. What about that next question, Trev?
The next thing we want to consider is, what does it say about his desire there, or lack thereof, that he followed at a distance?
Yeah.
I mean, chart Peter's decision. Why do you think that they got so progressively more intense?
Yeah. Following at a distance. It seems like he wanted to be close to Jesus, but not too close. And that there's probably a lesson there for us, isn't there? Sometimes we want to say, I'm a Christian, I'm a Jesus follower, but maybe I don't want to get too close. So, there's some thoughts to ponder there, right?
Right. I think Peter definitely was ready to fight, but not necessarily ready to die.
Ooh, that's a good point. That's very good. Now, as you look at Peter's denials, at first he just says, I don't know him. And then he goes, I am not one of them. And then he says, I don't know what you're talking about. It seems like each one of them, and Luke's account maybe doesn't give it quite as clearly as some of the other gospel accounts. And you might go back and read those in Matthew and Mark's accounts. But they seem to get progressively more intense. And maybe it's good to consider why. What's happening there? What's happening in Peter's mind as he denies Jesus? They just, if you were to chart that on a graph, and I'm no graph charter kind of a person, but if you were, it's like the denials start here, and then they go here, and then they go here, and they're just getting more and more intense as it goes along here. So why do you think that was? I think that's a good thing to consider. And so then that look. Have you ever gotten that look? Maybe from your wife or from your mother. My dad was a preacher, Trevor, and I know this is probably hard to believe, but when I was a kid, there were times when I was sitting in the audience, I didn't always behave as well as I should. And I can know a little bit about what a look says, because my dad, one time when I was cutting up with one of my buddies, he stopped and he just looked at me. I mean, he gave me the look. And I knew what that look was all about. What kind of look do you think that this was that Jesus was giving? Was it a look of a gotcha? Or was it a look of, why did you do that? Or,
I think it was, why did you do that? Brokenhearted.
Yeah, I think it was too. I mean, I believe that was right. And maybe there was a little bit of all of that,
Right, yeah.
Because it seems that this look triggered in Peter's mind what Jesus had said. Between the rooster crowing and the look, it triggered in Jesus' mind, or in Peter's mind, what Jesus had said about what he was going to do. And sure enough, that prophecy of Jesus was fulfilled.
I mean, that goes in right to the next question. I mean, in what ways do we deny Jesus today? I mean, there's so many opportunities that when we're asked about something or a chance that we have to teach someone about Jesus, do we necessarily think about when we don't take those opportunities? Do we really think about Jesus's face being there, something that could actually see us, not just taking that opportunity?
Yeah, there's an old song, watching you. There's an all-seeing eye watching you, and we think about Jesus as God being omnipresent, and maybe sometimes we look at that from a negative standpoint. Oh no, we're afraid He's going to catch us doing something. But really, we ought to look at it from the standpoint of how can we please Him as He looks at us, as He watches us. When He sees us, does His face have a smile, or is it a sad face? I think that's a valid question for us to consider. That's very good. So, if you want to right now, if you're watching this and you'd like to pause this and maybe deal with some of these questions and discuss this among yourselves, or ponder these questions for yourself, then now would be a good time to do that. Okay, so Trevor, so let's move on to the next section. So we've dealt with the qualms that Peter had. He had some uneasy feelings connected with the crucifixion of Jesus. And now we're going to deal with the qualms that Pilate has about this whole process, and how he gets sort of pulled into it by the Jews. And we're gonna read a little bit longer section. I'm going to read part of it, and then Trevor's going to read part of it. But it's in Luke 23, the first 25 verses, and Luke gives a pretty brief summation of the trial that Jesus has before Pilate and Herod. And if you'll notice, there's at least 3 accusations that the Jews are making toward or against Jesus in the presence of Pilate, or in Pilate's court. Luke doesn't record the whole hand washing scene. I think Matthew records that, where Pilate washes his hands of the matter. But you will see here in this section that Pilate has a lot of hesitation, and he tries every way possible to get out of this death sentence that he's going to eventually pronounce. So let's listen to Luke 23. I'll read the first 12 verses and see if you can pick up those accusations in this setting. Then the whole company of them, that is the Sanhedrin council, this Jewish mob that had brought Jesus before Pilate, arose and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." But they were urgent, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place." Now, when Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. Now, let me just pause right here and say, Herod, that name probably rings a bell. You remember Herod is a very notorious figure in the scriptures, and there's more than one Herod, but this Herod has been made the king of Galilee, sort of the ruler over that region, in the same way that Pilate was the ruler over Judea. So Herod's in town. He's got some Jewish background in his life, and so he's in town probably because of the same reason that so many other Jews are, the Passover, that whole big festival. So he's in town, and so Pilate hears this, and so he says, "Well, let's send him to Herod." Okay, so back in verse 8. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he'd heard about him and was hoping to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but he made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. And Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then, arraying him in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate. And Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day. For before this, they had been at enmity with each other. So, Trevor, pick up then the reading back with Pilate in verse 13.
Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people. And after examining him before you, behold, I do not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving of death has been done by him. I will therefore punish and release him." But they all cried out together, "Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city, and for murder." Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, But they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish and release him." But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will.
Wow. Now, as we think about this context, and again, I hope you have a Bible open and that you can read it and look at it as well. But here's some questions to consider. First of all, I want you to count how many times the innocence of Jesus is acknowledged by Pilate in this context. And as you do, then think about what might have been going on in Pilate's mind. He has this mob of people, these Jewish leaders who are clamoring for Jesus to be crucified, and yet Pilate's looking at this objectively and finding that their accusations are kind of bogus. So in light of that, in light of the fact that he found him innocent, why do you think that he proceeded to give Jesus the death sentence of all things? He tried every way possible to get out of that, but ultimately he gives him the death sentence. Why do you think that was?
And just how did Pilate try to put off making a judgment about Jesus when he heard that Jesus was a Galilean? I mean, he tried to pass the buck here to Herod.
Yeah. He said, well, I've got myself in a situation here, and so maybe there's a way that I can get out of this. And it's interesting, that whole trial before Herod, which leads us into the next question. What does it seem that Herod is really wanting from Jesus? Is he really wanting to be a fair judge in all this, or is he wanting something else? It seems to me, at least, that Herod's just wanting a spectacle. And I think it's very telling that Jesus doesn't say a word to Herod. Now, he converses with Pilate, but he doesn't say a word to Herod. And it's interesting. This is a little sidelight here. Okay, I'm going to chase a rabbit for just a second, Trevor. Herod was an Idumean. He was an Edomite.
What?
And if you'll remember, Jesus was a Jew. Jesus was from the line of the Israelites.
David. Yeah.
The line of David, exactly, from the tribe of Judah, but going all the way back to those twin sons of Abraham, or rather of Isaac, Jacob, who became Israel, the Israelites, the father of the Israelites, and Esau, who became the father of the Edomites. Do you remember that Jacob and Esau had a lot of issues with each other because of the things that happened and unfolded in that story? And now you see here, centuries later, an Israelite, a Jacobite, if you will, and an Esauite, an Edomite, in confrontation with one another. Isn't that something? That's one of those things that, Herod, this Edomite, is making these mockery and accusations against Jesus, and Jesus doesn't say a word. Doesn't say a word to him. By the way, and here's the rabbit I'm chasing. We need to understand that sometimes our actions have far-reaching consequences. This one reached over hundreds of years. The actions that Jacob and Esau had are now being played out in the life of Jesus. So that's one of those things that's just amazing in Scripture when we understand it. So when you think about what is it that Herod really wanted from Jesus, okay?
And
go ahead. No, that's good. This next question is interesting.
The next question is, if you had been Jesus' defense lawyer, I mean, what evidence would you present to defend Jesus against? I mean, these accusations, what would you present?
You think about those accusations. He misleads our nation or subverts the nation. He forbids us to give tribute to Caesar. And then thirdly, he says he's a king. As his defense lawyer, how would you have defended him? Interesting. And by the way, Jesus had no defense lawyer at all, did he? He barely even tried to defend himself.
Right.
It was prophetic in and of itself. And then finally, and I think this is a question that we as disciples of Jesus need to ask ourselves. As a disciple, as a follower of Jesus, have you ever had to defend Jesus or your following of Jesus to someone who questioned your allegiance to him? And if so, How did you do it? There's an old saying, Trevor, and I think you've probably heard it. If you were on trial as a disciple of Jesus, would there be enough evidence to convict you?
Right.
I think that's a good question, don't you?
It's a sobering question.
It is. Do you have enough things that are reflecting the following of Jesus in your life that if someone looks at your life, they could say, I know that's a follower of Jesus? And I think that's probably a very, like you say, a sobering question that we all need to consider.
To bring it back around full circle, what I said, Peter wasn't willing to die. Pilate wasn't necessarily willing to fight very much here. He wasn't willing to put up much of a defense with enemy. He didn't have to worry about them killing him because he's got the whole Roman guard there to defend him, but he wasn't willing necessarily to put up a fight and tell these people just to go home. He could have dispersed this. Instead, he gave in to their voices. In that verse that says, their voices prevailed. And how many times do we let someone else's voice prevail?
That's good. That's good. And maybe it's a question, what voice are we listening to? What voice are we hearing? And so, of course, our prayer is, and I know you echo this, Trevor, our prayer is that we will be a more faithful follower of Jesus. And on this weekend, when people in the world are celebrating the resurrection of Jesus, we need to understand that these are some of the events that led up to his crucifixion. And it's because people had feelings of uneasiness about their following Jesus or claiming Jesus' perfection and his innocence. And so the story of Peter and Pilate ought to serve as powerful examples to us for what followers of Jesus in these cases should not do. Standing up for Jesus, being willing not only to follow him, but even to fight for him if necessary. And as Peter even said, I'll die for you. And eventually he comes around to that, doesn't he? But it took some time. So thank you so much, Trevor, for joining me today and for your insights and discussion in this.
We miss everybody at Red Bank. Miss seeing everybody.
Yeah.
Can't wait man, you don't know how much you really love going to church. You really can't do it, man.
Isn't that true? That's so true. Thank you for saying that. And we do miss you. We hope that you're staying well and healthy and taking care of your family and your friends. And maybe I would just encourage you, if think about where you sit in our assembly on a regular basis. Think about the people that sit around you. And if you think about it in the next day or so, maybe give somebody a call and just say, hey, how are you doing? I've been missing you. Can't wait till we get back together. So that'd be a good thing for you to do. So Trev, thanks. And thank you for joining us today. And I hope that this lesson has been beneficial to you and most of all pleasing to God. God bless. We're signing off now.